welcome everybody to our webinar today. We're excited to have two excellent guests who actually were part of a plenary at this year's 2025 Collaborative Journalism Summit in Denver. If you saw them there, that's great. Welcome back. And if you weren't there and didn't see it, I'm happy that you get this opportunity today. This is the first in a series of monthly webinars put on by us, the Collaborative Journalism Resource Hub. I'm Amy Maestas, the director of the Hub. The Hub started in January this year to advance the field of collaboration in journalism across the U.S. You can find out more about what we do at the link that I just put in the chat. Happy to talk to anybody who's interested, whether new people we've talked and worked with before. We will probably ask you to fill out an intake form so we know what we're going to talk about. I'm excited to introduce our host today, who will talk about how collaboratives can work with influencers. Adriana Lacy is the founder of Influencer Journalism. She's written a lot about this topic, super knowledgeable about this topic, about a lot of journalism topics, but she and Emily Ristow, who is director of local news transformation at American Press Institute, have done a lot of research and training, doing cohorts to learn about influencers and journalism. Adriana has her own consulting agency that works with media organizations to engage audiences. And Emily at API has been running their influencers learning cohort. A couple of links I'll put in the chat also, a link to Adriana's website and to some information on API's website for influencers. And of course, we will share these resources with you in a follow-up email after this webinar. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Adriana and Emily and let them tell you how they want to interact with you and what we're going to do for the next hour.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Amy. As we're kind of introducing ourselves and talking about what we'll go over today, I encourage you all to introduce yourselves in the chat as well. We'd love to know who else is in the room. I know some of you know one another already, so good to sort of see those connections popping up as well. Adriana, do you want to say anything else about yourself in way of introduction?
Yeah, of course. I just wanted to say, I think this is a really great topic that we're diving in today. I think there's been just so much interest in how these collaborations can work, what it looks like to work with influencers. And I think what's really special is there hasn't really been a ton of effort around collaborations, collaborative organizations working with influencers. So I think this is a really exciting time for those of you who are really interested in this work, because I think there's definitely a lot that can be done.
Yes, I wanna echo what Adriana just said in terms of our preparation for this. We weren't sure whether there were any collaboratives who had done this sort of work before. So we also really encourage you, if you've been experimenting with this, or if you have examples of doing this yourself, to drop those links in the chat as well. And speaking of the chat, we'll use that to kind of gather questions as we go through some kind of basics today, talking about what these collaborations look like. And then we'll also have plenty of time for you guys to come off mute and ask some questions at the end of the session too. But definitely stay active in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that as we go. So I think a great way to start is just, how are we defining influencers? So do you want to kick off with that, Adriana?
Yeah, that's such a great point. So one thing I just kind of want to start with is, I think the biggest thing to think about when we talk about influencers is really just understanding how much of a complex ecosystem it can be. I think influencer is a word that I use a lot when I'm talking about this genre of work, just because it's a word that's a bit more accessible to folks, and it's a word that I think most people are pretty interested in and kind of know about. But typically what I find is that a lot of the folks that I work with don't consider themselves to be influencers. It's definitely not a word that they're calling themselves. I see some of them refer to themselves as content creators. I think just the word creator in general has become really popular. I know API has talked a lot about this term trusted messenger. So I think that is just one thing to consider, is that not everyone in this space considers themselves an influencer. And I think just figuring out what they like to be kind of called is something that's really important to remember. But overall, when we're looking sort of in this influencer space, we see a lot of different types of influencers, from the really small to the really large. I think a lot of times when I talk about this work, people are imagining, some sort of partnership with a really famous person who, sells tummy teas on Instagram or something like that. But a lot of times these influencers that I've worked with news organizations are typically smaller audiences. They have really great community roots. These might be people that have 10,000 followers. They might have 20,000. So a lot of them really are on this more micro influencer level. So these are people who have really small audiences. And then, of course, we have these larger communities as well, people who might be 50, 100,000, even up to 1 million, these larger influencers. So I think there is just a really large group of people when we're having this conversation. But I think something that's worked best for a lot of the newsrooms that I've been working with is really targeting more of these micro influencers, even though they have a little bit of a smaller audience. What I find is that they tend to really move kind of the needle in terms of public perception and things. And there's really just a shift in the whole influencer world to kind of work with these smaller audiences who might not have as many followers, but they do have higher rates of engagement, higher just activity with their followers as well. And yeah, Emily, would love to have you kind of talk a little bit more about trusted messengers, because I know that's something API has been doing a lot of work around.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that term. So what I like about that term and what I think that works with a lot of local news organizations is it expands your thinking outside of that social feed. So when you think about trusted messengers in a community, it might be a football coach, it might be another community leader, it might be a pastor at a local church. It really gets you thinking outside of sort of, I don't know if you hear the word influencer and you picture something like Adriana mentioned, like someone trying to sell a product or a makeup tutorial or whatever it is. That trusted messenger language can really help you think more broadly and think about who are the people who already have these deep connections with the community members that you're trying to reach. And that's really, like Adriana said, when these collaborations are so successful. So they might not have, well, they probably don't have, right, like 100,000 followers. They have fewer than 10,000, but those are people who really trust them and look to them. And those are folks that like they're engaging with through their feed and their content as well. And then one other thing I kind of like to mention when we talk about this term influencer is I like people to think about how they are also influencers and how they themselves have been influenced by others. Because if you think about a recent time that you were influenced to do something or buy something, it might be a colleague or a friend or a family member who you're thinking of, not some like stranger on the internet. So also think about like those sorts of relationships that you have in your life too. And also a lot of the time, those were positive interactions, right? Like you're really glad that you did that thing or you bought that thing. So that can kind of help open up your thinking a little bit about this if you are someone who gets a little bit nervous about this concept of influencers. So I think now that we've kind of explained who these folks are, I think it would be good to talk about like why we want to do these sorts of collaborations. What sort of goals should we be having with these? So Adriana, do you want to start us with that?
Yeah, of course. So I think this goal setting part is a really, really important question, because I've seen a few newsrooms kind of wanting to go into this work thinking that it's pretty much a conversion strategy. So they're thinking, if we do this influencer partnership, then we're going to, increase our bottom line. We're going to have more members. We're going to have more subscriptions. But a lot of times we don't necessarily see that to be the case. A big reason for this is because a lot of times these partnerships are happening on platforms like TikTok and Instagram, where we're not really seeing that sort of click-through rate and that follow-through as well. It's really more of the top of the funnel sort of engagement work. So I think just kind of understanding and really setting those expectations really early is something that I think is really, really important. There's a few sort of KPIs that I've been thinking about when I do this work that has really helped kind of frame newsrooms to think about what their goals can be for these sorts of projects. So the first one I think is a natural, which is this idea of just reaching new audiences. So if you're looking at, getting a younger demographic, you want to have a more diverse demographic. Maybe you want to reach people who have not been engaging historically with your journalism. I think that's a really great kind of goal to have overall. So that's just really expanding reach and things, which I think is a really great goal. And those are things you can track by, the number of people who engaged, if they follow you or not, where they're from. All of those sorts of things can give you some data to back up those KPIs. I think another big goal you could look at is really just around building trust and credibility. So really thinking about, maybe you want to work with a trusted creator to increase trust in your community, to increase trust around information. That's another great goal. If you're working with an influencer who already has a lot of that trust and they're considered a trusted messenger, like Emily talked about earlier, that's a great goal to have as well. Something else I've been thinking about a lot is kind of this idea of driving engagement in conversation. So if you are looking to spark dialogue, comments, community interaction around a topic, that's another great partnership idea. A newsroom that we're going to talk about a little bit later on is the city, who used an influencer to promote their voter guide. So that's kind of a great example of how you can sort of have a goal of really driving engagement, driving conversation, getting people educated about a particular topic, which is something that can be really helpful. And then I think encouraging civic action can also be a good one as well. I've seen organizations use influencers to encourage people to register to vote, to encourage them to submit feedback on something. So I think actions like that can be a really great goal to think about as well. I think it's always okay to have in the back of your mind kind of that idea that you want to grow your audience or you want to grow your membership. But I do think that it is important to remember that that's definitely kind of a phase 2 or 3 to think about. I think initially we're really thinking that top of the funnel, we're finding new audiences, things as well. But I think down the line, I have seen some newsrooms who are working with an influencer maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 times, and then they've sort of, very quietly kind of wrote out a subscribe to our newsletter or, become a member at this link. But that definitely takes a lot of time to get there versus just kind of doing that as your first collaboration. So I think that's just something to kind of think about when you're working on this sort of work. And just kind of on this note, I know we've been talking a lot about how, we haven't really seen a lot of these sort of partnerships happen for collaboratives yet. But one thing that I did want to flag that I thought might be interesting for you all to see, and Emily, if you don't mind sharing this screen now, is really just an example of what this collaboration could look like for a collaborative. So what you're seeing right now, hopefully it shares. Yes. So what you're seeing right now are some screenshots from the New England News Collaborative. I had a chance to work with the New England News Collaborative a few years ago when they were kind of thinking about what their shared project would be as a collaborative. So this is a bunch of organizations, primarily public radio stations in New England. And what we were really thinking about is, what can they do as kind of a group to figure out what would be the best thing for them to tackle. And I did a day-long workshop with them where essentially what we did was take a bunch of survey data that we got from their members to really understand topics that were really important to their audiences. And one topic that we saw was really interesting was this idea of the environment and nature and climate. And what they did together was created this Instagram account called Our New England. And this is kind of some of the screenshots that you're seeing right here. And essentially what they do is create shared content that lives on this page. They typically have collaborators from each newsroom creating these videos. And now they sort of have this standalone account that's educating you all about New England news. Most of it's about the environment, outside, things like that. And I think having a shared product like this is a really great starting point for influencer collaborations, because if an organization like this wants to get into this work, they have an account that they can think about. They have an account that they can actually do these collaborations, and it's something that's visible for their entire organization. So this is something I think that's important for collaboratives to think about. If you want to do these sort of partnerships, is really figuring out, what account are we going to do this on? Who's going to be the collaborators? What's our end goal? And I think having something like this can be a really great way to kind of, hop off there. But I know there's probably a lot of hesitation in the room and kind of worries about, what this looks like. So Emily, would love to kind of hear from you and what you've seen about really how you can get started with this work.
Yeah. So the guide to influencer collaborations that Amy dropped in the chat has a lot of good advice about this as well. So I definitely encourage you to go in there. But I wanted to talk just a little bit about this idea of internal buy-in and messaging once you have established amongst the folks leading this what your goals are going to be. So the first, obviously, is that you want to identify those goals, and you want to really talk about that in terms of how it is both benefiting your collaborative and your individual organizations within the collaborative, as well as your audiences, right? And a big thing is you don't do journalism so that nobody sees it, right? So a big benefit of these sorts of partnerships is that you're reaching the target audiences that you hope to be reaching with your work, and you're helping inform them and get them the information that they need. So how you're talking about that is really important. So you also want to think about who within your organizations, who within your collaborative team needs to hear this message, and how that message is best scripted, and the environment that you're delivering this message across any sort of projects that I work with newsrooms on. This is where I see people stumble most often, is they don't really take the time to think about the individual motivations and goals of the people that they're trying to reach and get buy-in from and collaborate on something. They go in with their own thoughts and their own motivations. And they also don't think about how they're delivering that message and the environment that they're delivering that message. Is it better to do so in a one-on-one meeting with certain folks? Is like a team-based setting better? What's probably not great is just a full organization-wide all-staff meeting. You really want to be thoughtful in how you're introducing this concept, because it's not just about sharing that message. It's really about giving folks an opportunity to share their concerns and for you to really listen to what their concerns are. You don't want to brush them off because it's like, well, I've thought about this a lot more than you have, so like, don't worry about that or whatever. You really want to listen carefully to the concerns that people have, and update your plan based on what you're hearing from folks. Different people bring different perspectives. They may have thought of some things that you haven't. They may feel more strongly about certain concerns than you do, so you may want to adjust your plan related to those. So a lot of these steps probably sound familiar to you all in other work that you've done, as well as this final one about building in feedback loops throughout the process. So you don't just want to ask people what they think at the beginning and then show them the finished product at the end. How are you continuing to communicate about this with folks as the project is unfolding, as some of the collaborations are starting to post? So those are all important things to think about. And I also want to note before we transition into our next area that I see Adriana is responding to a few questions in the chat too. We are watching your questions. I'm copying some into a document. So some of these we'll get to, and some of these we'll ask you to talk about on mic once we get to the full Q&A portion. So just definitely keep the questions coming. But that idea of like, once you sort of get that buy-in for your collaboration and you've decided what kind of project is going to work for you, we kind of wanted to talk about what that looks like in terms of like picking that particular project. And what's great is what we see has worked really well with these is if you're zeroing in on a particular topic area or niche, which a lot of your reporting in these collaboratives are around a particular topic area. So you have a real clear target audience for your work. And again, also, if you're trying to reach folks that maybe you're not reaching otherwise, these sorts of collaborations can always be a good solution for that as well. And then there are a few areas that maybe don't work quite as well for these sorts of collaborations. If it's a very fraught political topic, that can be difficult, right? Like information and conversation moves very quickly in an online space. So you want to be aware of that. There's also certain parameters if you're looking to boost some posts as part of these collaborations that you can't around certain topics that are more political. So that's also something to be aware of. Also, if a story is like highly sensitive, or there's an investigation or type of story that really needs to be conveyed in like a very specific and detailed way, that can also be a little bit difficult with these sorts of partnerships. We have seen it work but there is a lot more in the back and forth of the scripting and all of that as part of the collaboration. So if you're doing something that requires really specific terminology or a really particular way you need to talk about something, you definitely want to build in more time for the scripting of the actual video and the back and forth with the editing of that before anything is even filmed. So we showed some examples of what our New England account had done, but what other sort of like deliverables are there? Like I think people probably assume like, oh, like a co-hosted reel. We've showed some examples, but Adriana, what other sort of collaborations have you seen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest thing, kind of probably the most obvious one that you've all probably seen is some sort of, collaboration on Instagram or TikTok. So essentially what happens is you have an influencer, maybe they read a really great story that they like from you, they make a video about it, you add the collaboration request, and that's sort of the piece of content in the deliverable. I think there's other ways that you can also think about sort of what you want an influencer to do. So I think that kind of co-created content, which I just mentioned, is probably the most straightforward that I've seen. So maybe it's an explainer, maybe they're amplifying things. I think that's a really great place to start. It's pretty easy to do, especially if you already have an article in mind. So you're essentially just handing over the article to the influencer, working together to kind of create some sort of video that can last, and that works really well. Other things that I've seen are some platform crossovers. So really kind of letting the influencer take over your account and actually create some content, maybe share something interesting, doing things like that, and kind of giving just more of a background on who they are to just kind of grow trust and awareness. I've seen a lot of newsrooms also do things like community engagement. So maybe they're doing an Instagram live, they're doing a TikTok live or a Reddit AMA, things like that, to build audience questions and engagement. I think that's a really great way to do it. And then the last way that I think is really important, but I haven't seen as much of it done, which I would love to see more of it, is actually doing more social first storytelling with the creator. So instead of saying, oh, we already wrote an article, like, can you make a video about it? Saying, hey, what's a topic that we cover that you're really interested in? And maybe we can make some sort of social first video together. I think sometimes we feel like there has to be some sort of print article or something has to live on a website for it to be an effective collaboration, but I have seen some social first content do really, really well, where you're essentially just kind of figuring out if there's a story, a topic that your audience is really interested in, and then kind of working with that. So I think those are just some different kind of examples of things to think about when you're looking at kind of what that content could be. Something else you could also look at is figuring out, are there ways that your creator could help you, in the comment section? Maybe they're doing some engagement themselves. So I think there's lots of ways you can really go about that. Typically, I recommend if you're working with a creator that you build into your contract or whatever that you do that, your newsroom has the final say on kind of the copy that goes up, the video that goes up, and just making sure that you're looking at all of that before it goes live. I think that just kind of gives everyone peace of mind. And I think there's kind of lots that you can think about there. But on the topic of kind of, contracts and getting everything together, I know API has a really good guide of kind of all of the various templates and things. But yeah, I would love to know, Emily, kind of what you all are thinking about of getting newsrooms kind of ready for this sort of work.
Yeah, I'm a lot of what you mentioned in terms of like what does that process look like in terms of editing and scripting. Also, you can think about like the tone and the style and things that you may not think about with other folks you work with, like can they swear in the video? Just like there's some things like that to consider as well. I will also say that one thing we discovered, Amy mentioned this cohort that we just wrapped up with 16 different organizations. Several of them, this contracting process was more complicated than they anticipated because it wasn't just like a regular freelancer contract, because there was video involved and there was posting on multiple accounts and things like that. So you really want to make sure that you're talking to the right people in your organization around these contracts, because the other thing that we haven't mentioned specifically, but I think has been implied, is that these are paid collaborations for the most part. We had some organizations partner with some government agencies and they're not allowed to accept payment. So those were unpaid partnerships. But for the large part, the organizations that we're working with are paying these folks for their time and their work, right? So that's why this contract is so important. And the level of detail is important in these as well. And as you're approaching these conversations, I really encourage you to think about how you're onboarding these collaborators to your organization, how you're letting them onboard you to their work and their brand. And really, it's not the same as hiring just a normal freelancer. One of my colleagues, Marlene Harris Taylor, was talking about this as we were going over what we were seeing from this current cohort. It's very different. Like, it is a true collaboration and it's a true partnership. So you really want to, like, that takes extra time. And we've mentioned trust a few times, and I know there's some follow-up questions around this concept of trust too. But that really is part of this. You want to make sure that both sides feel like the collaboration is valuable to them. You want to trust one another, and you kind of have to move at the speed that allows that, right? So this isn't a process that you really want to rush through. There's one other kind of deliverable that I wanted to add on to what Adriana shared too, and that is the idea of live in-person events. So we've seen some of these creators show up as like an MC for an event, so they're also bringing in their audience. They're promoting the event. They're talking about it after on their account. So that's another thing that we've seen is sort of breaking down some of that separation of digital in person and kind of bringing it together, which I know some of your collaboratives have done in-person events in the community as well. So that might be an interesting starting place for some work as well. So now we want to get into a few examples of collaborations, and then we'll get into the big question about vetting collaborators after that. So I just want to make sure folks know we're getting to that as well. So let me stumble through resharing my screen here to show some examples here. All right, so this first one was one that Adriana mentioned before, but the group, The City. So this organization is based in New York City, and they have actually been in 2 of API's influencer cohorts. So the first one back in fall 2024 was focused on election guide content. And they did one video collaboration with the creator Jerry Lim on the screen here, also known as Pigeon Post. And they, as Adriana said, were looking to promote their voter guide. And they knew from looking at Jerry's work that they were going to be a good collaborator. They were kind of reaching the audience who was interested in politics in New York City. And they said, let's do like a person on the street sort of interview. Like, you can ask people questions about voting, and you can, see if they know the answers, and we can refer them to the voter guide. And Jerry was like, well, that's fine, but that's really not what my audience is looking for. Like, Pigeon Post is much more of a satirical kind of like recap of news and information, kind of the style of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. So the city was really smart to follow Jerry's lead and go with what they knew was best for their audience and what would resonate well. So that collaboration got them a lot more views and reach and engagement and comments than they got with videos that just the city posted on their account. So in this second round of the influencer cohort, the city decided to partner with Jerry again, but this time in a 3-video partnership where Jerry did a few different videos leading up to the mayoral primary that they had in June. So I just dropped a link to one of those examples in the chat. But basically, like, you can sort of get an idea of what the style of the video is like from the screenshots here. And the other thing you can see is it wasn't just like the co-hosted reel. They had also agreed with Jerry to do some different sharing on their stories to link to content that they had on their website. So that's another thing that you can talk about with organizations as well. But what I love about this example is that it really was a true collaboration, and they were really listening to one another about what were the goals, and they established those shared goals. The second example I have is from the Houston Chronicle, which was in this recent cohort. And I brought this example because it was sort of an organic way that they stumbled on this idea to partner with creators. And what happened was they had noticed this huge spike in their annual dining guide, but it was like a previous year's dining guide that they were getting all this traffic to. And they're like, what is going on here? And they realized that a creator in the Houston dining scene had talked about the dining guide and had shared a link to the previous year's guide, not realizing that the new guide had already come out. And that gave them the idea that, oh, this could be something that we could really partner on. And so In this case, they worked within their food team, like the editor, the dining critic, audience editor, and came up with a list of influencers or creators that they were interested in partnering with and they felt like they would trust and would be good partners for this. And they landed on Sean, who you see in this video. And they also did like a 3-video series with Sean. The first one was his traditional style, where he took people to a restaurant that was recognized in the dining guide. It was just him recommending some dishes, trying some stuff out, pushing people to the dining guide, letting them know that it existed. But the second video was he went along with the food critic to a restaurant, and the food critic actually talked about, what does this all involve? Like, what sort of dishes are you ordering? What are you looking for? How many times do you visit a restaurant? So it's a really nice example of being able to incorporate your journalists into these collaborations as well. And giving this like behind the scene look and sort of explaining how things work. So I will drop the link to this video in the chat as well. And then I know Adriana has another example here too.
Yes. Here's kind of one more example of something that could potentially be a really cool partnership idea. With Verite News, they have a reoccurring series on TikTok and on Instagram called Porch Poppin'. I wish these videos would loop. I don't know why they're not. But essentially what happens in these videos is they actually hire two sort of creators, content creators in the community to actually be kind of their regular hosts for this series. So this is a really good idea if maybe you have one or two people that you know would be really great for this sort of work, and kind of hiring them on kind of a contract basis, very similar to the way you might have someone as a freelance writer. And this can really help because number one, you have that consistency, you kind of know what their style is, you know they're going to kind of deliver on that. And of course, it makes it just easier to manage because you're not having to revet someone every single time you're looking for some sort of influencer partnership. So this is kind of an example of what that could look like. I've seen a few people, a few news organizations hiring like social hosts. I know Axios has done a lot with their local organizations. I know that the Philadelphia Inquirer just hired someone to be a social host. So I think there is this kind of growth in kind of having one person sort of be the face of your kind of social video effort. So this could be another way to do it. A few years ago, when the LA Times first started getting on TikTok, they actually hired Under the Desk News, who a lot of you might know, to be their TikTok host to start everything. So that's a really great way to kind of look at doing it, just having one person instead of, you know, a big rotating group of people. And then just kind of something else to think about with all of this is I think that if you're wanting to get into this influencer work, you're looking to work with more social video, I do think it's really important to make sure that you have your own social video plan for your newsroom or for your collaborative as well. I think just one video every 2 to 3 months isn't really going to move the needle. So making sure you do have some sort of video plan in place is really important. Number one, influencers are just very expensive sometimes, so you don't want to have to be shelling out, you know, hundreds of dollars every time you want to make a video. So a lot of the work that I've been doing is, you know, not only just finding influencers for these newsrooms, but also getting newsrooms to think about, you know, what is our video strategy? You know, are there influencers in our newsroom that we can get in front of the camera and get more comfortable so that we're supplementing our video content? That way you kind of have a stream of video content. Maybe sometimes it's a reporter, maybe sometimes it's an influencer. And I think just kind of having that balance and kind of working with both of those together can really help you grow your strategy. So I think just in the back of your mind, like if you're thinking about, all right, we want to experiment with an influencer, I think it's also just important to realize, you know, what is our video strategy right now? And do we have one? And if we don't have one, just figuring out what your short form video strategy can look like. And I think a lot of you who have been in the industry for a while, you probably think about video and you're thinking about, you know, pivoting to video and Facebook and all of these really well-produced videos. I think what we're seeing now is really a lo-fi approach to all of this works really good. Most of the videos that people are consuming on TikTok and on Instagram are not heavily produced and edited. It's very much just someone talking in front of their camera. It's someone talking with the article they wrote right behind their head. So I think it is a very much a low touch strategy as well. So I think that makes it really accessible for smaller newsrooms, for collaboratives that are just getting off the ground, because you can really have a bit more of a forgiving audience in the videos that you're working on. But now that we've kind of given you some examples, would love to pivot a little bit to talk about, how do you find and vet these people? I know there's been a lot of questions in here. I know there's been so many starting with the beginning about really what it looks like to actually find these influencers. So one thing that I'll share is a link to one of the API guides that I had written about how to map your local influencer landscape. I think this is a great thing to kind of look at for the nitty gritty and how all of this work is done. But I think the big thing to think about is there's a lot of ways you can go about this. On the very short term, I think just looking, on a platform like Instagram and looking at the location tag, for an example, and figuring out, are there people with really big following on Instagram that are in our community that would be a good collaborative partner for this work? Is there someone who exists on TikTok who's really big and you just find them by searching in keywords and things? I think there's some very much like low touch approaches you can make to find these influencers. There are a lot of tools and platforms that exist as well if you're looking for, to really scale this work. There's a lot of really big systems where you can search people by their following size and their location and the topics that they create. So sometimes that can be an option as well. I've done a lot of work with newsrooms where I will work to find them a list of 30, 40, 50 influencers and kind of give them the opportunity to figure out who's the best person for this. So I think there's lots of ways you can kind of look for these influencers. I always recommend asking the young person in your life who they follow, and you'll probably get a few even just that way as well. Figuring out, asking your community members, who is someone that's really interesting in your community that you really like. I think a lot of people don't talk to their audience and ask their audience enough these questions. So that's another kind of good way to go about finding some of these influencers. And then I think once you find them, you have to really start thinking about, what that vetting looks like. I'll let you talk a little bit more, Emily, about kind of what the vetting looks like. And something I also put into the chat is I made like a little influencer vetting worksheet. So this is definitely something you can take advantage of if you're looking about how to vet these influencers.
Yeah, thanks. I'll add too, in terms of finding influencers, we had one organization in our cohort technically that put an article out on their website and on their social media saying, hey, we're looking to do these sorts of collaborations. And that was how they actually got connected with one of the people that they work with. So in terms of vetting, that worksheet that Adriana has is great. Definitely check that out. And I do want to stress too, if you look at this section of the guide, a lot of the questions that we have in there for kind of vetting these collaborators are going to look really familiar to you because they're actually inspired by the partnership guide that Heather Bryant wrote for the Center for Collaborative Media. So it's, do they align with your collaborative's values, goals, and purpose? What questions might arise about your collaborative's fairness or perspective if you're connected with this person? How might you talk about this collaboration and its scope? So some of the same questions that you have in the chat too that we'll get into, but these are questions that you have already asked yourselves in terms of forming these collaboratives. So you can sort of think about partnering with these creators or influencers as expanding that collaborative in a way. And it doesn't need to be a permanent expansion or anything like that. But those are some of those same questions around alignment and perception are what you want to ask when you look into some of these partnerships too. So in addition to that worksheet that Adriana shared, we also have a list of green, yellow, and red flags from Molly Munka of Trusty News in that API guide. So you can kind of look through that and see, I think it was Adriana who I first heard say this, but their social profile is like their resume, basically. So you kind of want to look through if they do advertisements or sponsorships, are they labeling those? Are they disclosing those? Are they trying to present information accurately? If there are errors, how do they go about correcting those? Do they correct those? Or how are they engaging in the comments? Who is also engaging in the comments with them? And as well as, are they attributing sources of information? So those are some of the things that you kind of want to look for. And I would say just really trust your gut. I think a lot of questions that we get from folks about certain, if they're unsure about a collaborator, it's that they really that maybe isn't the right person for them to work with. And they're sort of like, they see that yellow or that green flag, but they're like, oh, but there could be some advantages if we do this or whatever. But really trust your gut. And it might take some time to find the right person, but you will find the right person to partner with. So I think we're close to getting to your questions here that are already in the chat, and any additional ones you wanna pop in there. But before we do that, we want to return to this idea that Adriana said at the beginning, was like, this isn't necessarily like a money play or a conversion play. It's really about community engagement. So do you want to say a little bit more about that, Adriana?
Yeah, absolutely. I know there was a comment in here a little bit earlier, kind of just talking about this idea of trust in news. And I think that's a big reason why a lot of these collaborations can work really well with influencers. I'm sure all of you know that there's definitely been, an all-time low trust in the media, and there really is a lot of work that needs to go into building that up. And I think something that we're really starting to see is, and firstly, influencers are actually really having very high trust rates with their audience, especially those who, very much engage with their audiences. They're very interactive with their audiences. They seem to have very, very high trust rates. And I think there's lots of reasons why that is, polarization and things like that. But I do think that human connection is also a big reason why we see this happening. I think a lot of times when people are following and engaging with influencers, especially those who live in their area or talk about a topic that they're really interested in, they feel like they know them, they feel like they have that connection with them, which can be really powerful. And I think sometimes when I talk to younger audiences, especially, they sort of see newsrooms and journalists as kind of, up here, and we're kind of down here, and there's really kind of that gap there. So I think the more and more that we can do to really just sort of, embrace this, really just start to build up this trust again. And I think just, being able to see reporters more and really understand how journalism can be done is something that I think works really well. I saw an influencer recently make a really cool social video about how journalism is done. So how you kind of go and report the stories, and why news organizations always say allegedly in posts and things like that. And people were so, fascinated. They were like, oh, I had no idea about any of these things. I had no idea about all the legal implications. And I do think that sometimes, not only is this humanizing and personalizing a lot of this information, but it's also building trust and literacy in media, which is something I think is missing for a lot of folks. So I think this is really a win-win for everyone, to build trust, but to also really just educate folks on how journalism is done, and why all of this work is so important. I don't know, Emily, if there's anything else that you wanted to add.
Yeah, I would add that, like, so the organizations that were in the cohort, we asked folks to kind of identify different signals of trust that they had seen from their collaborations. And a lot of those showed up in the comments that they were seeing. And sort of like, we asked them to sort of look at like the tone of the comments and whether things are like positive, negative. And I would say like overwhelmingly, they saw positive comments from folks, where folks were maybe like pleasantly surprised that they saw that this brand that they maybe thought of as a little bit like stodgy, like collaborate with someone that they knew. And it really helped in some cases sort of bridge some of the distrust that communities had with these organizations, or they had sort of lumped in that organization with this like idea of the media that they had in their head, right? And this collaboration made them sort of separate that out and help them see this local organization as its own thing that was like also people living in their community. The other thing I wanted to add is just this is a little bit more of an advanced thing, but one of the organizations that API's worked with twice, Fact Checkieado, actually designed with influencers a course and training for Latino influencers on how to fight mis and disinformation and how to like vet information. So there is, I think, an appetite from creators too to understand some of these tools that we as journalists might use when it comes to verifying information and checking accuracy. So that's a case study that's definitely worth checking out, and they have examples of what you can, things like sort of the things that they went over. So yeah, do we want to get into some questions then?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Yeah,
All right.
feel free to answer questions that are in the chat. If any of our attendees here have a question you want to elevate, feel free to come off mute and ask. We've got about another 12 minutes for you to take this opportunity, and I'll wrap up maybe in about 11 minutes. I'll start wrapping it up for us.
Okay, perfect. I did see one question in here that I thought was really good from Carrie that was basically talking about trust. And the question was really sort of how do you think about trust with influencers and their audiences versus trust with journalists and their audience, and what can journalists learn from influencers and vice versa? I thought this is a really great question and had a little bit to do with what I was just talking about, those levels of trust. And I think that the biggest thing that I think journalists can learn from influencers is really just how they engage and interact with their audiences. I think because of the role of influencers, a lot of them are doing this full time now. They're getting a lot of their income done from this, that they really do feel accountable to their audiences in maybe ways that journalists used to be or haven't been as accountable in the past. And I think you see just a lot of dialogue, a lot of responses, a lot of communication between these creators and their audiences. And I think that's a really great thing that news organizations can learn from, whether that's, being more active in the comment sections, having more conversations. I think that is a really great kind of indicator of trust and something that we're starting to see a lot more of. A great example of this is I'm seeing a lot of news organizations just be more active with responding to people. The New York Times, for example, they obviously have a very robust comment section and a lot of editors who do a lot of community engagement, and been seeing a lot of the reporters actually going in and answering questions from the audience. Why did you decide to publish this? Why didn't you publish this earlier? Things like that. And I think just having those sorts of conversations can really just help move the needle when it comes to trust. So I think there's lots that you can learn there. And I do think influencers are learning a lot about this work as well. I went to a panel with some influencers a few months ago, and something that they mentioned was that, a lot of them aren't trained, as journalists, especially those who are in this news information space. They do a really good job of telling you the news, but they don't have any journalism backgrounds. And I think that journalists can really help these news creators understand what it's like to share something, what it's like to vet information, to make sure that they're sharing reliable information as well. So I love that one of the newsrooms in the cohort is actually doing more of that training with newsrooms because with influencers, because I think that's so important. And I think there's definitely a need and a want from these creators to actually, gain more experience in fact checking and verifying and things like that. Anything you want to add on there, Emily?
I would just say, like, to the second part of this question about like what journalists can learn and gain from influencers in this regard, I think there's so much, and that was a really I don't want to say surprise. I don't know. It was a very good thing to see in terms of like when we were going through initial applications for this cohort, that a lot of people were wanting to be involved in these collaborations because they saw these influencers and creators as like fellow professionals that they could learn from versus just like someone we're going to hire for this one transactional thing. So I do think there's lessons kind of like beyond the trust, but sort of how are you interacting with your audiences? How are you being authentic in these spaces that organizations can learn from as well? So there's a question here around advertising in the collaborations and like boosting posts, which was a common stumbling block, I would say, in the cohort that I just finished. So I wonder if Adriana, if you want to start by talking a little bit about that, and I can kind of fill in based on what we learned from
Yeah,
the group we worked with.
this is a good question. So I think just number one, just talking about payment in general. I know Emily mentioned this earlier. Pretty much all of these, there's an expectation that there will be payment. Something that I will say that I have found is that I've reached out to a lot of creators, influencers on behalf of newsrooms, and a lot of them have pretty much said the exact same thing. Like, here's my traditional rates, but I'm happy to work something out. I think there's really an interest, honestly, from creators to work with newsrooms because this is not a partnership that they normally do. Most of their partnerships are selling something, someone gives them a product and they have an affiliate link and they're selling something. They're getting paid to get people to buy something. And this is a little bit different because the currency is really information, and it's kind of a collaboration that they probably haven't done before. So I see a ton of interest in this in general. I see a ton of willingness to work with organizations. A lot of them have nonprofit discounts. So there is a little bit of negotiation you can do around this. I always get this $1 million question of, how much does an influencer charge? And unfortunately, the answer really is it depends. But I can tell you that I know of newsrooms that have worked with influencers for as low as $100 or $200 per video. I've seen some spend up to $1,000, up to $5,000 for video. So I really do think it remembers who they are and what they're doing. Some of these people might refer you to an agent. It's very common that a lot of these influencers have agents. Some of these folks might already have a rate sheet that they send to you that gives you all of this information. And some of them have maybe never done a partnership before. So I think it's important to kind of figure out what you want to pay these folks as well, and just making sure that it is equitable across the board based on, whatever key metrics that you're looking at. I see a lot of people think, just because someone has 100,000 followers, they should be paid more than the person who has, 50,000. But I do think it's important to also look at the engagement rate of these creators as well. Something that I see a lot of is people who have really big audiences, but very low engagement rate. So maybe they have, 100,000 followers, but they only get about 1,000 likes per post, or maybe there's someone who's smaller, but the engagement rate is much higher. The audience is a lot more dialed into what they're posting. There might be, a reason to go with that person. So I think that's just something to think about when you're looking at pricing and who you want to work with, is that you're not focusing just on these vanity metrics of just followers, but you are looking at, are people commenting on their posts? Do people seem to have a very positive sentiment towards this person? That can be something that guides you as well. In terms of just kind of advertising, something that I have seen with a lot of these creators and these partnerships is that a lot of newsrooms will end up like boosting the post as well. So I see a lot of work where someone might make an Instagram post with a creator, they do a collaboration report, and then maybe they put a few $100s, behind boosting it so more and more people see it. I think that can work. Something I see a lot though is that a lot of these audiences are already really big, so you don't necessarily need to do that. But I know that, some sort of paid promotion is something that people are thinking about as well. But typically in terms of just payment in general, I've typically seen it sort of be, you create the content and we kind of pay you upon delivery of that. I've seen some people put down a deposit if it's a longer term partnership. So I think those are kind of just a few of the things to think about. But we'd love to hear more about some of the stuff we've watched you at, Emily.
Yeah, I would just add that you want to be aware of the different parameters that platforms have, like collaborative reels on Instagram. You can't boost those if they're longer than 90 seconds. There are certain topics that TikTok just totally will not approve ads around, including anything political. So you just really want to be aware of those. I would also say that some advice that we've heard from folks is when you do like a co-hosted reel, you want the news organization to be the original poster because you'll get better access to analytics. That also will allow you to boost it if it is under 90 seconds. Otherwise, you have to like do a partnership ad, and it's a much more complicated process through Meta's ad manager. So just really make sure that you're kind of familiar with those parameters, and that if you do really want to do a boost, that you are creating content that will allow you to boost. I know we're coming up on the time here. So I think we'll both share our information so you can get in touch with us with any like follow-up questions and stuff too.
I love the question. Oh, can I just ask this one question about collaboration that didn't work out?
Yes.
I just wanted to flag this really quickly. I think this is definitely something that has happened where there has been, relationships that haven't worked out. Typically what I find is that a lot of times if you vet an influencer, you can really figure out these things before it goes live. So I think that vetting is really important just to find that. I do think there are times where you're going to see the influencer post something later on that might not vibe with your organization. And I think that's just something important to remember. These people are not journalists. They're not necessarily always going to be neutral. A lot of them have an opinion. That's why they're influencing people, because they have a point of view. So I do think that is just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind, that not everyone is going to be, the cookie cutter perfect influencer. But I think the best thing is, what are you comfortable with? What is your newsroom comfortable with?
Great. We have, I don't know if you have any examples of local TV stations. Frank's asking of creator partnerships. I don't know if you know any off the top of your head, Adriana or Emily.
I
We
don't.
we
I will
we yeah, we weren't able to get any TV stations in this current cohort, so we don't have any, unfortunately.
Will there be additional future cohorts with API around influencer?
We hope so. We'll share that information in API's Need to Know newsletter and on our website if we are able to open up more cohort opportunities.
Great. Well, this has been very helpful and lots to learn today for people who are either individual news organizations or collaboratives. And happy that you are joining us in this, starting this conversation around collaboration and influencers. Yeah, my deep gratitude for you both for continuing the conversation from the plenary at the summit. Adriana says if anybody's at Lion or ONA, seek her out. I don't know if you'll be there, Emily, but please let us know. And also please let us know if anybody comes away from this with a brilliant idea and starts getting Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce to talk about your collaboration. Now is the time. Seize the moment. We would love to hear about that. And otherwise, we'll all see you again soon. Please sign up for our newsletter for information about upcoming webinars. Thanks again, Adriana and Emily.